Thanks everybody for joining us. If you were here for the last session, this one may dovetail nicely with it. What I'd like to talk to you about today is an approach that we have taken with several of our customers, both large and fairly complex, as well as smaller, to tackle some of those really sticky, monolithic applications. So what we're talking about could be very old, Windows-based workloads on an older version of .NET, maybe something that was built on an old enterprise database. So we've tackled a variety of these. Another big use case is an old development framework like Cold Fusion that is no longer supported, can't find people. So these are all the types of monolithic applications that we've taken. We are working with a client now to apply this framework for a mainframe and slowly starting to at least relieve some of the burden on their mainframe as well. So I'll talk about, sort of how we got started in tackling these types of applications. Basically, some of our experiences, and then walk through some use cases of real world practices using this framework. Just in case you're not familiar with REAN Cloud, I'll go very fast, especially since our booth is right there, so you can stop by afterwards. Basically REAN Cloud, we were a born in the cloud Premier Consulting Partner for AWS. We have a large number of AWS professional and associate certified team members. We have, one of the largest collections of competencies when it comes to AWS as well. And you can also find us in Gartner's Magic Quadrant. Some of the big news is that just about a month ago, we were purchased by Hitachi Vantara, and are in the process of going through that, integration. So, last year, one of our largest clients came to us and they started talking to us, you guys are doing a great job of migrating some of our standard workloads into the cloud, rehosting them, refactoring them, but we have some of these really difficult old monolithic legacy applications that we need to move. And we began talking to them about how to do this. And every time we approached the subject, the cost and the pain of moving those monolithic applications, was just daunting. And the thing that we, eventually came to was that, if you're going to approach this, one of the key principles is, approach it as part of sort of a digital optimization or digital transformation initiative. And so we started thinking about, not each individual application, but thinking about the applications, as a portfolio and what this could do for the organization to help it along its digital transformation journey. So one of the things that we were talking with them about is that, when you think about, what the cloud is doing, especially for infrastructure, that effort to, deploy and manage infrastructure is this blue line that, that especially, Amazon is really driving down. They're providing a lot of tools, a lot of automation capabilities to really drive down the cost, the complexity, the effort for deploying and running infrastructure. So the thing that we were challenging ourselves on was, how do you create that same kind of curve for application development, for enabling your business? And so we were looking at their technology stack, and one of the things that we started looking at is that this organization primarily processes transactions. They're taking in other people's transactions, they're processing their own, and then they're sending those transactions out to downstream consumers. And we started looking at it, and the approach that we decided was that, if you're really going to take this application and, use it as a catalyst for your digital transformation, you need to start breaking it up into reusable parts. One of the things that they've been talking a lot about are microservices. And microservices are great, but when we were speaking to this organization, what we were really focusing on is this idea of taking these microservices and sort of wrapping them as reusable APIs, and that taking that microservice and make it easier to use, not just for the technical staff, but start making it easier for the business to begin to understand what it is and have access to it. And so, the approach that we took is we started looking at the applications and we looked at them as a portfolio. And we picked the first application that had enough complexity within it that we would be able to harvest a reasonable number of APIs and a reasonable number, amount of business logic. And that was the first one that we targeted. And as we looked at them, but at the same time, we also didn't want so much complexity that it was going to take forever. So basically, we needed something that we could migrate fairly quickly, get some business value, and start building support for this project and this program. And so then we moved to the next one. It had a little bit more complexity, a little bit more business logic, but each time as we were creating these APIs, these microservices, the more complex applications that we kept coming across, it started bringing down the overall complexity for each of those applications. And so this was essentially the strategy that we put in place and that we started executing for them. So, while the red application curve, that's that's an ideal. We understand that you're probably never going to get the application curve down as far as the infrastructure curve, but the goal was to keep pushing it farther and farther down. Now, one of the things is that there are tools and platforms out there that are already trying to do this. But one of the things that this particular customer really wanted to get away from was they were trapped by one of these enterprise database vendors. And so going to them and saying, let's put a different layer, sort of an application development layer that traps them in again, was something that was not appealing to them. So we began talking to them again, and our approach was, when we would go after each individual legacy application, the first thing we looked at is, how do we extract the data out of this? And the reason is when you think of these legacy applications, normally the value is trapped in two places. The first place is, by the way, the clock is not running. The value is trapped in two places. It's trapped in the business logic. That's what we want to expose through the microservices and APIs. But there's also a lot of value trapped in that data. So the first thing we started doing is looking at their data layer and starting to extract that data out into a data lake. And this started getting that data out and exposed to data scientists, data analysts. The other thing it did is we got some of that data out of that monolithic application that didn't really need to be there, and enabled us to start building some of those microservices. So we could start pulling that data out, creating a version of it in more like a NoSQL database, and then start using that as a platform to create some of these new microservices and APIs. So that was the first piece that we looked at. Then we started looking at the monolithic application itself. And again, one of the things that you find with monolithic applications is that there will be pieces of functionality that were added to this monolith that never really needed to be there, except maybe that data was already trapped in there. So since we had gotten that data out and made that data useful, we could start turning those pieces of functionality into microservices, and then when appropriate, wrap them as APIs. So, one of the things that we were really looking at is that, you're going to start creating these, microservices. They may need to run in containers, but really starting to look at this layer, the API management layer or the API gateway layer, and thinking about how do you construct that in a way that starts making it easier for, essentially less skilled developers to be combining those APIs into into business applications. There are different ways of doing that. One of the things that we help them do is pick some very API-driven front-end applications. Identify the list of libraries that you could use to quickly start assembling. Analytical applications, and started creating this layer that gave them a nice library of APIs and business-friendly terminology that allowed the business to begin understanding what was available for them to begin transforming how they do business. And so one of the things that they began to see is that, rather than needing very expensive computer science degree developers for creating their entire stack, what they really needed, they could have, essentially lower cost resources up front who understood the business better, and then the computer science level resources could then focus on creating those microservices. And tying that all together, one of the things that was absolutely critical was creating that layer of automation. As you're creating these microservices, many of which were built using serverless technologies as well, really creating that full CI/CD pipeline with automation throughout it. Because if you start, as you start pushing the responsibility for creating these business applications farther and farther to the edge, you need to have that automation of quality control, security, built into the release process, from the beginning to the end. And so part of it was laying a very mature DevOps foundation for them. A generic look at what their stack ended up looking like. On the far left, there were the legacy applications that hadn't been modernized yet. But then what we started connecting into those legacy applications were the data pipelines to start pulling their data out of the application and into the data lake. Then, when possible, start packaging that data into more modern database technologies and data formats, creating data services on top of that were easy to use. And then where needed, especially since they did have some very high-speed transactional requirements, also creating that layer where they did still use the relational database, and they did have that very high-speed, low-latency connection to the data stores as well for those applications. But what this allowed them to do, and one of the things that they were very positive about, is that what they were able to start focusing on more is that business logic layer and the UI visualization layer, and they stopped having to manage the whole stack and having to worry about the whole stack. And Werner this morning was talking about builders and developers not having to think about the applications or the servers, that they can just focus on that business logic, and this was the way that we helped them achieve this. They were completely bought into AWS, so we created this logical sort of pattern for them that demonstrated, here are some of the key services and the main services that we think that you're going to be using across each of these applications. This diagram is about a year old, but this was the one that we that we showed them. So there's the front end layer where the data can flow in. There's the essentially that API layer that consists of the microservices, the business rules, business logic, and then the high-speed transactional data layer. It can feed into the data lake, as well as drive reporting straight into a Redshift data warehouse. This is one of the key things, is that reporting for them was captured and constrained in each of these monolithic applications. So they were doing a lot of they were having to pull a lot of data, transform it, send it through multiple hops before it actually made it into their data warehouse. And by pulling it into the data lake first, not only did it make it more usable for things like machine learning, but it also but it made it easier to feed that data warehouse that just became another published part of the data warehouse. One of the things that we were able to do, and that we were able to show and start building that momentum, is that we took a manual process that normally would require about 2 weeks, 2 weeks to just create a single report. We were able to automate that and turn it into a real-time intelligent dashboard for them. And what they began moving towards is this idea of, rather than having the right applications, how do you assemble them without getting locked into a comprehensive, sort of a comprehensive development platform. I covered this since I'm running out of time. Basically, what the project approach looked like is we started off, in that assessment phase, and one of the key things was really starting to hone in on what is that portfolio of applications that we can use. Just looking at the applications individually, again, was going to be too expensive without enough value. So we focused on that, came up with our recommendations, and then slowly began re-architecting and creating APIs and microservices. Some of the legacy applications, we would only pull pieces of it off, and we would just decommission the functionality. There were times that we made that risk-based decision that, actually changing the application and going back and rewriting some of that legacy application to use the new microservices and the new APIs, there was enough business value there that they were willing to make that investment. So it wasn't a one-size-fits-all. Some applications we were able to decommission almost completely. Others we just slowly began shrinking down to a kernel of what they needed to be, and then eventually would replace them wholly as well. Now, part of this is that our mentality and their mentality was that they did not want to be dependent on us. So all of this was run in integrated Scrum teams, so they were fully involved in the Agile process. And for us, you really can't transform digitally without fully embracing not just the cloud, but that Agile development process, DevOps. And so basically what we were doing is on-the-job training, on-the-job knowledge transfer, even though we did provide managed services for them. So this was essentially the project approach that we took for them. Sorry, I won't get to the actual customer use cases, but I will be standing over there if you want to talk any more about a couple of the ways. If you got some of the IoT-enabled wine from the Sestra device last night, they're actually one of the small examples of how we approach this. Thanks, everybody.